Hello and welcome to the Dublin Book Festival and the Royal Dublin Society Lecture Series. My name is Turtle Bunbury, and over the next little while I will be speaking with this gentleman, Michael Smith. Michael is an expert on all things polar. His books include An Unsung Hero, the biography of Tom Crean, and Shackleton, By Endurance We Conquer. We're here to talk about Michael's book, Icebound in the Arctic, The Mystery of Captain Francis Crozier, and the Franklin Expedition. This is the first comprehensive biography of Crozier, who's a remarkable explorer, ill-fated, from County Down. Michael, first of all, you're very welcome to the hot seat.
Very nice to be here.
You state in your introduction that your simple aim, is to place Francis, Rawdon, Moira, Crozier among those exceptional individuals who shaped Arctic and Antarctic history. I think you've achieved that, for starters. But that name, Michael Francis Rawdon Crozier, it's quite a name. We can come back to Rawdon and Moira maybe later on, but Crozier, any family that has a sort of Z in its name always looks a little mysterious to me. What do we know of his family background?
Almost certainly the family came over with William the Conqueror in 1066. They settled in the north of England originally, and they came across to Ireland. This particular branch of the family came to Ireland around about 1630, 1640.
Okay, so
and they stayed. And they built up a fairly substantial portion of land up in County Down around the town of Banbridge, which at the time was beginning to thrive from the growing linen industry. Mm-hmm. And Francis's father was a solicitor, and he worked for the landed gentry basically. So he had a seat at the top table. Yeah. And so they were relatively well off, not filthy rich, but relatively well off family.
Okay, so they're farmers in linen and solicitors.
It's, primarily solicitors. They didn't do any farming. But what is interesting about Francis is that he was one of 13 children. And most of the men either went into the church, very religious family, went into the church, or they went into the law. Francis, for some inexplicable reason, is sent off to the Navy at the age of 13 in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, which is an incredible leap.
Exactly. So, is it inexplicable? Is there any sort of hint that he has nautical genes, any family members that are in the Navy?
None at all. Any connection with the military was a background in cavalry officers.
Okay.
One of the Crozier's descendants was a guard at Dublin Castle, that sort of thing. So there's no real strong military connection.
In Banbridge, there's a river. Is that you've been paddling up and down the river?
The Ban, I'm sure it was, the Ban would have been used, but it was used at that stage mostly for the linen industry, which was thriving. Very much a cottage industry, but a thriving cottage industry. And Francis's family, the father works, as I say, solicitors for the Downshire's in particular family, and so they were relatively well off, but a comfortable place in society. Yeah. That was the crucial thing. So there's no obvious reason why he was sent to sea. And if you stop and think about it, if you have a 13-year-old son, would you send him off to war in Napoleonic times when the casualty rate was horrific?
Okay, so hang on. So what year was he born?
1796.
1796. So he's joining up at 1809, 1810.
1810, just before his 14th birthday. He's still 13.
Midway, roughly, between the Battle of Trafalgar and Waterloo's coming.
Very much so. The beginning of the Peninsular War, basically. And primarily, the Navy in those times was used as both a battering ram, but it was a very important industry to maintain the blockade, so that the French couldn't be supplied and that we could bring in supplies. That was the aim of it. And he would have been on patrol duties.
I was going to ask, so he saw some action during his younger years?
Oh, unquestionably. The thing about the action is you think of, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, that the casualty rate was horrific. 90,000 seamen died during this period. But nearly all of them, something like 80,000, died of wounds and diseases like cholera and scurvy and things like that. They weren't killed by bullets or shells.
Right.
So the casualty rate was horrific. And yet he survives.
And he survived. That's quite a baptism, as you say. He's 13 years old. I mean, I have some nautical ancestors. They all seem to join at the age of 11, 12, 13.
Yeah.
Amazing, except that, you know, by the time you're 18, I think Nelson joined at that sort of age as well, and by the time he's 18, he's in command of a ship. Isn't that? I mean, that's the thing. You're a steely veteran by the age of 17,
It was essentially
18.
a schooling. You know, they more or less went to school as young cadets at the age of 12, 13, 14. It was a very common. Captain Scott, very famously, went off to naval college at the age of 13, and that was a century later. You know, so it was a very common thing to do if that's what you wanted.
But they're not exactly school dropouts, because they're also going to be the people who are going to, you know, rule in terms of surveying the seas and magnetic observation, all these amazing skills that these people who all have school at 13.
Yeah, but Francis developed those skills in a sense on the job. You know, he became quite an important maritime scientist.
Well, let's go to that then. Okay, so after the Napoleonic Wars is all over, 1815, I imagine there's quite a lot of officers and men in the Navy, you know, still at the end of that war. How does he think about leaving the Navy, or does he stick with it, and what does he do? Take me through the 1820s. Really.
The crucial thing to bear in mind is that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain ruled the waves, quite literally. And it's the beginning of the British Empire as we knew it, in a sense, because there was a glib overstatement, but there was nobody left to fight. You defeated your nearest enemy, which is the French. So we had this massive navy with nothing to do, more or less. Now, they threw all the ordinary seamen back onto the quays where they'd been press ganged in the first place. But you couldn't do that with officers. And so they looked around for other things to do. And one of the things they did was exploration. And they were desperate to find what was called then the Northwest Passage across the top of Canada. And Francis was carried, there was a wave of enthusiasm. And for 30 years, the British sent ships north into the ice in the hope of finding the Northwest Passage, which they, of course, never did. But Francis got swept up in that.
He was part of that. Okay,
Very
so
much
that quest for the Northwest Passage, it is the holy grail for these explorers. I know it goes back. I remember reading about Tudor explorers who were all, you know, heading off in those days. I think in the 17th, 18th century, it was primarily to reach China, possibly India. But the motives had sort of changed by Crozier's day, hadn't they? They were...
Yes, exploration was almost a badge of honour. You didn't want Johnny Foreigner getting there before you and putting up the flag and opening a post office. You wanted to be there first. And so the British devised this dramatic expansion of the empire. In the 19th century, the British Empire more than doubled in size. And the Northwest Passage was it was pretty big before it, but you imagine you double it because you added India, you added great chunks of Africa, you added chunks of the Middle East. All these places before were open, and there was this drive to gain control. And so everywhere you went, you stopped off and planted the flag and claimed it in honour of the king or the queen, whoever happened to be on the throne at the time. So it was an age of expansion, and it was very popular. The explorers of the day, such as James Clark Ross and Edward Parry, these were the poster boys. I mean, they were really popular men, and society threw the doors open to them. And they were knighted, and they were given quite large...
It's very glamorous. I mean, it seems like a very glamorous world. When these guys are taking off, everybody comes down and waves them off time and time again.
Huge fanfare, and these men, make no mistake, they were incredible explorers, and they were going quite literally into the unknown. There was no backup, and of course, most important, they were sailing ships. So they were dependent on their sailing skills. There were no motors in those days. And Crozier was carried along on that wave of enthusiasm.
So he moves into exploration in the 1820s. I know he obviously becomes one of the most experienced polar explorers of his generation. Could you talk us through some of the highlights from those trips that went on?
I think where I would start, for those who don't know about Francis Crozier, is just look at the volume of work that he did. Francis Crozier sailed on 6 expeditions to the ice. He's one of the very few that went to the Antarctic and the Arctic. Now, this is no criticism, but if you look at someone like Captain Scott, he did 2 expeditions. Crozier did 6. And he spent pretty much all his life living out of a kit bag.
Did many people do 6? I mean, no. I mean, were there sort of 10 people who did 6, or is he right up there?
No. He would have been one of the very few. The only one who exceeded him was his best friend, who was James Clark Ross, who was another great explorer, very much the same age, very similar background, and they were great friends. And Ross was an exceptional explorer, and it gives you some idea of Ross was said to be the most handsome man in the Navy, and society threw themselves at his feet. They loved him. Very dashing, charismatic figure. And when they decided to go and have a look at the Antarctic for the first time, Ross was given pretty much a blank sheet of paper and said, here, what do you want to go and do this? He had the whole Navy to choose from. He chose Francis Crozier as his deputy.
As his number 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he had the whole Navy to choose from. So thousands and thousands of hardened naval officers.
Okay.
And he picked the man from Banbridge because he trusted him.
He trusted him, okay. And they'd been on adventures before?
They'd worked together on several expeditions, and they tried, for example, they tried to get to the North Pole at one stage, which they failed miserably to do, but that was partly to do with they didn't understand what they were doing.
Yeah, but they had a shot at it anyway. So.
They had a shot at it. One has to remember these men were pioneers. That everything they did was new. They didn't know necessarily. They made mistakes. They didn't, for example, they never learned how to live off the land, which is they didn't understand scurvy. They didn't understand things like driving dog teams. One has to.
They liked life on a ship because they were Navy people, or what?
The simple thing is that they took home from home, so they took their Navy ships with their fine bone china and their engraved cutlery, and they took servants and they lived in the ice, as being if they served on fine bone china by their servants.
Like they're still in the big house.
Whereas they'd have been better off had they gone outside the door and watched how the Inuit hunt. Why don't the Inuit get scurvy when all the British sailors were getting scurvy? How far can you go with a team of dogs? They never bothered to work out how do you drive dog teams. It's a skill, you need to learn it.
Did people not? Nobody's sort of tried to work those out?
They never bothered.
Why is that?
Classic British superiority.
Right.
They assumed that the Inuit were children, savages.
Yeah,
There was nothing they could learn from savages, effectively. I'm paraphrasing that.
Yeah.
But that was the
mindset.
The mindset, yes. So there was nothing that the Inuit could teach them, whereas they'd have been better had they spent time just watching and analysing. How come these guys don't get scurvy and we do? That was a really important point.
I think that's going to become very important as we get on in the story. Right, okay. All right, well, that, as you said, the quest to find the Northwest Passage was the biggie. In terms of, actually, first, before that, I want to get a little bit into Francis's private life, because not that he had much of a love life, but he fancied ladies every now and then. I thought it was very interesting when you talk about one of his ladies, who, spoiler alert, is Franklin's niece, and how she kind of spurned his offer partly because she said he was already married to the Navy.
Yeah.
He does, he is very reliable, he's very industrious. You'd want him on your team. Number 2, absolutely. Does he ever do downtime? Does he know how to turn off?
I don't think he did. I think his sense of duty was the overpowering emotion in Francis Crozier. And he loved it. He was really good at it, make no mistake. He was really good. But he certainly was madly in love with Franklin's niece, whose name was Sophie Craycroft. And he asked her on many occasions to marry him. And she refused. And the classic rebuffal is that she liked the man but not the sailor.
Okay.
And that kind of summed up almost 10 years of fruitless pursuit of Sophie Craycroft.
Oh, the poor man, he put in 10 years. Well, she came down to wave him off when he set off on the big expedition. And we're going to come to this now. The Franklin expedition, as it became known, you might argue that it should be called Crozier expedition. This is, I think I'm right in saying, the most expensive expedition that had yet set sail? Or
it was the biggest, the grandest expedition. And they wouldn't hear, the establishment, the Admiralty, the Royal Geographical Society and all those sorts of people were utterly convinced that this was the one. If you think about the Northwest Passage as a jigsaw, the assumption was that there was about 200 miles of the map of northern Canada as we know it today was missing. That was the bit that hadn't been found, and that was the Northwest Passage. Okay. They just assumed that they would find the passage on this trip, and they were so confident that they made no contingency for backup.
Okay.
So they left without backup. It would be like going to the moon and not having
NASA.
Hello Houston, we have a problem.
Right, yeah.
There was none of that. They had no backup.
I mean, is it comparable to that? I mean, in terms of, I suppose, the cost and everything that's going into it, do you think it is, sensible to compare it to an Elon Musk mission or a NASA mission to faraway universes?
In a curious way, yes, and in another way, no. I mean, we knew more about the moon than we did about certainly Antarctica in the 1840s. But there were literally no footprints there. And if you think about the Antarctic, just as an example, it's bigger than all of Europe, and there was nobody there.
Okay.
There are no natives in the Antarctic. There's no wildlife. The wildlife is on the coast. So these were real pioneers.
Yeah.
And when you get to the Arctic, they had been there quite a bit, but they hadn't done the final bit of the jigsaw. And the people who did know how to live off the land, the Inuit, they had no respect for them.
Right, okay.
So they went rather naively they blundered into it, but with quite astonishing bravery. One should not underestimate that. They were very courageous people.
100%. With this expedition, the Franklin expedition as it would become, you would think that our friend Crozier, he has an incredible CV at this point. He's been to the North Pole, or tried to find it. He's been to the Northwest Passage, tried to find it. He's been to Antarctica. Yeah. Everybody says he's great. Your friend Mr. Ross has already said he's my number 2. And yet, when it comes to the Franklin expedition, he is not number 1. He's not even number 2. Why is this?
Yeah, this is a complex bit of background here because the man who was given the leadership was John Franklin, who, in my opinion, was very badly suited to be leader. He was quite a nice man, but he was nearly 60 years of age. He wasn't in great health, and he'd never commanded an expedition at sea before.
Why, these are all very valid points.
Yes.
Why then entrust him with this incredible
Because
mission?
He was at one stage the governor of Van Diemen's Land, which we now call Tasmania, which is a prison colony. And he fell out with the civil service and they fired him. In effect, they removed him. And it was felt that we, the British establishment, owed him a favour. And as somebody put it much better than me, another writer, said Franklin got the job because everybody felt sorry for him.
Wow, okay.
His wife was a very, very aggressive campaigner a campaign manager, you might call them in today's terms. And she lobbied the government very heavily that John Franklin should get the job. Crozier was far and away the best suited for the job, but he had something of a breakdown, an emotional breakdown, after coming back from the Antarctic. Again, one has to just, in parenthesis, pause for a minute. He'd been away for 4 years in the Antarctic. An absolutely grueling experience. He was also pining after Sophie Craycroft, and he had a bit of a breakdown. And I don't think he wanted to be the leader, but he was far and away the best equipped, as you say, the best CV. But they gave it to Franklin against the wishes, I think, of the top civil servants at the Admiralty, and Crozier agreed to go as deputy.
Did Franklin invite him along?
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
Franklin singled him out. And
he knew his qualities and his dependability. So they took 2 ships. Franklin was the captain of one ship, and Crozier was the captain of the other ship.
Oh, so he was actually number 2. Sorry.
He was he was deputy, but in those days, an awful lot of the Navy, the establishment, excuse me, was to do with patronage. It was who you knew was more important than what you did. And so the man who was number 3, a perfectly good officer called Fitzjames, was given a lot of Francis's jobs to do. And so he was, you know, they cut the feet from under him, cut the ground from under his feet, I should say. And that was a terrible decision.
Okay, so the glorious days of nepotism.
Pure nepotism. And Fitzjames wasn't a bad man at all, but he went off to the Northwest Passage. My guess is he'd never seen an iceberg in his life.
Wow, okay.
Crozier had spent getting on for 30 years with icebergs.
Okay, so Crozier is now, what age? It's 1845, so he's pushing towards 50 now.
He's pushing towards 50, yeah.
Okay.
And he's had this breakdown. As soon as they go off, they leave London in May of 1845, and we have some surviving letters from Francis. And when you read between the lines, he's deeply unhappy. He looks around at Franklin and realises he's not the ideal boss.
Oh, he doesn't have faith?
No, he's got serious concerns. And he's got concerns, all sorts of things. Franklin is a very avuncular, very nice, deeply religious man. But for example, when they're crossing the North Atlantic in a gale, he invites Francis over for dinner. This involves a rowing boat in the North Atlantic gale being rowed from one ship to the other, just so that he could have his dinner.
Okay.
It was that sort of rather impractical.
Okay.
But, you know,
the show must go on territory, but it's...
Exactly, the show must go on, but it was almost oblivious to the facts.
Yeah.
You know? And so Francis had some misgivings about Franklin, and he was much more concerned apart from Franklin's abilities. He was concerned about his decision making, but in particular, he was concerned they'd sailed too late, and this is really important because the season. The navigable season for ships in the Arctic is very short, about 2 months a year.
But otherwise it's frozen?
It's just frozen over,
okay.
And you're going to get trapped. So he thought they'd left it too late, that they weren't going to make any progress, and they were therefore going to spend the winter encased in ice. And the winter will last for between 9 and 10 months.
Okay. Right.
And so he saw the danger, and of course that's exactly what happened. He was absolutely right. Francis Crozier knew what he was doing.
Okay, because we're now quite close to, they've set off, they're heading up, and quite soon we're going to lose sight of them, and we're not going to find them again for 175 years or something like that, 170 years. What is the last sighting of them? And maybe you can just talk us through
it's a very, very evocative scene, this, because they cross the North Atlantic, past Greenland, and go up the Davis Strait towards what is today Canada. And as you go up the strait, you would turn left to go into this labyrinth of seaways in the Northwest Passage. And they bumped into a couple of whaling ships, and they had dinner with the captains, and they would have passed on their last letters, which of course we have. And I've seen, for example, Franklin's last letter to his wife. You know, it's very, very emotive stuff. And that would be...
Would they have known that these are probably going to be the last letters we're going to get out of here for a while?
Yes, for at least a year.
Yeah, okay.
They were provisioned effectively for 3 years. But as I said, Crozier thought they'd left too late anyway, and so he would have had serious misgivings about that. So they gave the letters to the whaling captains, waved farewell, and then they disappeared into the silence and were never seen again. 129 men, 2 very well stocked ships with 3 years of supplies.
Right, okay. Now, can you bring us up? I know that Sir John Franklin died on the 23rd of June 1847. Can you bridge that gap from them going missing? What do we know?
What we know is that the first winter passed relatively unscathed but trapped in the ice. The second winter they moved down. So in 1847 they began to drive south to go southwest. As you drive south down these icy channels, they were confronted by a huge landmass. This landmass is in fact an island, King William Island. They thought it was attached to the land. Everybody did at this point.
Okay.
You could go left which is the Northwest Passage, as it turns out. They didn't know this. Or you could go right, which is effectively into the jaws of the lion.
Okay.
They thought that if you go left, you're going to run into a cul-de-sac because that's land. So they turned right, or steered right, I should say. And so the ships were trapped.
So if they had turned left, this would be a very different story from here on?
Quite probably.
Oh.
There are lots of ifs and buts about it, as because the ships are very heavily laden and the water's quite shallow, they might have had trouble getting out. But the crucial thing is that the west side of King William Island is teeming with game. The east side, which is where they were, is a barren desert.
Okay.
There is no game. Even the Inuit don't go there because they can't be supported. So they drive south, immediately hit ice. And when you say you hit ice, you need to bear this in mind. This is colossal build-up of ice. It would drive on shore from the sea by about a mile. And we're talking about mountains of ice that's being driven down the various channels. The ships are stuck in that. During that period of 1847, Franklin dies. Crozier is now in charge. And the rather sad fact is that he's now in charge of an expedition for the first time in his life. He's in charge of a disaster because the ships are trapped. He's got over 100 men and they ain't going nowhere.
Except they are, in the sense that he's going to take them on a overland trip.
Well, he made the decision, the crucial decision is made. Do you wait for the ice to relent, if it relents, you don't know if it is, or do you abandon ship and make a dash for where you know there will be some wildlife, for example, some Inuit support?
What distance are we talking from where the ships are to the wildlife?
The nearest wildlife would be between 200 and 300 miles. The nearest settlement would be around about 1,000 miles.
Oh, okay.
But you've got over 100 men and you've got to feed them on the way.
Yes.
Hopelessly optimistic to expect to get out.
Okay, well, if we can just get a handle on the conditions in those parts. I was listening to an interview with Ranulph Fiennes, who'd just been, did he do back-to-back 8-month missions, one to the North Pole, one to the South Pole, brought his dog who peed on both poles, so the dog's apparently now in the Guinness Book of Records. Anyway, he said that, it's just interesting to get the idea of just how arduous those conditions are. I mean, how cold would it get? How much darkness? Is it pitch black for like months and months?
Yes. Darkness is 24-hour day darkness for 4 months.
Wow. Temperature,
minus 30, minus 40 would be common. And for those who don't know, minus 40 is the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit converge. Oh. So minus 40 is the same in both.
Okay, because it's just so cold, you may as well have them both.
It's very cold. Trust me, it's very cold.
Right.
But also, the crucial thing here is the diet. They would have been eating effectively salt beef and sausages and canned beans and things like that. And as anyone who works in the public sector will know, that the current vogue in the public sector is to outsource all your suppliers. Mm-hmm. Well, the British Admiralty outsourced the supply of food and they sold it to a cowboy, basically. And so the food was pretty much rotten.
Okay.
It was rancid and there was hardly any nutrients in it. And
so not what you need when you're stuck for a winter or two.
Completely opposite of what they need. But also it's a recipe for scurvy. You get scurvy from a lack of vitamin C, and you get vitamin C from fresh fruit, vegetables, and a bit from meat. They had none of that. They had a spoonful of lemon juice, which was fine up to a point, but it wasn't enough. And so the ravages of scurvy would have taken over quite quickly.
They're having a very hard time already. Okay, so
extremely
they've got
hard.
The scurvy, they're icebound. They are the Navy, and the Navy, it's a strict disciplinary
very much
outfit.
So, yes.
I can't imagine they're all sitting around just waiting to die. What do you think they would have done to entertain themselves, to keep their minds occupied?
The answer is we don't know for sure, but they had overwintered many times before during this onslaught after the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain sent all these ships into the Arctic. They'd worked out quite elaborate schemes to entertain them. They even had a theatre company,
Right.
which performed. They dressed up in women's clothes and performed plays, and they
Okay.
play plays by Sheridan and people like that, who was fashionable at the time.
Yeah.
And so they will have been able to pass the time, but of course the main concern in their minds would have been hunger. And as I said before, they were provisioned for 3 years. They were now approaching the 3-year mark, and they weren't able, or weren't capable, rather, of living off the land, killing the wildlife. Not that there was much anyway.
Okay, right.
So this was a slow countdown. There's a chapter in the book which I call a slow execution, and that really is what it was. It was an awful period for them.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
people were obviously dying quite regularly.
But sporadically over the.
Well, we know because Francis Crozier left the only written record.
Well, I was going to say, I was
What
going to come on to
happened?
this. I think one of the most tantalising things that makes it so dramatic is the slow release of information over the course
Yes.
of time, ever since it went missing. And what we're talking about, the sort of message in a bottle, except it was in a tin can or in something
Yes,
like
it
that.
would be in a tin can and then covered in stones.
Okay, so
that
this
the
is
bears wouldn't
this
get
is the first. Well, basically the main clue of all times until recent times, perhaps. So it was in a can. It was a tin can. What was in it?
There was a standard Navy form which you'd leave. Everybody did if you wanted people to know where you were. So you'd leave your coordinates of where you were. This was a standard Navy form, and on that form, written in the margin, we learnt that Franklin was dead, Crozier was in charge, and then Crozier wrote these 9 words on the bottom. Actually, if you look at the document itself, Francis's words are written upside down in the top right-hand corner.
Okay.
You have to really struggle to see it, but
They're
what
out of
he
paper?
says, probably out of paper.
Yeah.
But what he's saying is, I'm going to what's called the Great Fish River, because that's where there was a settlement around about 1,000 miles away.
Okay.
And that's where he was headed. But that document wasn't found, unfortunately, for another 11 years. And it was the key to where to look for them.
Okay, because meanwhile in England, there's a
Meanwhile,
lot of
back at the
families wondering where their husband, father, son has gone, including Lady Franklin. And I think you said there was something like 40 expeditions went off in the immediate few years after that.
It took them, it was a very slow burner. For the first 3 years, you can imagine this, these guys went missing, and they were missing for 3 years before anybody woke up to the fact they'd gone. And so it wasn't until 1848 that people began to get concerned. There'd been no sighting of them in the Pacific, basically, which is where they should have been.
Oh, they were meant to pop out the other end.
Yeah, they thought, they should be in Hawaii,
Right.
enjoying themselves on the beach somewhere. Well, from 1848 onwards, Britain sent a flurry of ships in search of the missing expedition. And they sent around about 40 ships. In fact, some ships got lost looking for the lost explorers. They had to be rescued themselves.
Right.
And it was a frantic effort.
What sort of area is it? I was thinking about it in terms of the hunt for the Malaysian Airlines flight. I remember seeing some footage of the area of the Pacific that
Very
they were
appetite,
covering.
yeah.
And you just realise it's just so massive.
Well, the area that you're looking at is roughly 800,000 square miles.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's bigger than all of Western Europe.
Okay. I didn't
But there's nobody in it.
yeah, nobody to give you a clue.
And there's almost no wildlife.
Okay.
But the important point is that you sent all these 40 ships, and they combed the waterways and the ice and the land and everything. Dozens, hundreds of men, and they looked everywhere but the right place.
Easily
the only
done.
place they didn't look was where they were,
Well, it's
as
like-
it turns out.
Like losing me car keys. It happens all the time, doesn't it?
Well, you do, or you put the phone down so you get someone else to ring it, but they didn't have that facility.
Yeah.
And there was one particular explorer who told them where he expected them to be, and the Admiralty wouldn't listen to him.
No.
And he kept banging the table, saying, you've got to look in this area around King William Island. That's the place they'll be.
And they wouldn't listen.
And they wouldn't listen. They looked everywhere else.
It's like a Greek curse, isn't it, for the poor man?
It is. And of course, in the only upside, if there is an upside in this rather sad story, is that what they did is, in effect, they mapped northern Canada.
Right, yeah.
Not meaning to, that's not why they went,
Yeah.
but they ended up mapping northern Canada. And Francis set off with his 100-odd men marching overland to try to reach the Fish River, which actually they almost certainly never made. And the Inuit testimony is, as they put it so succinctly, men fell dying as they walked. So they were trying to march out over hundreds of square miles with no prospects of finding wildlife.
Okay. Well, we better talk about the unpalatable side of things as well, because obviously stories were starting to come back at this time from the Inuit that there had been instances of cannibalism.
Yes.
What do we know of that?
Well, there's a very great Scottish explorer called John Rae. And John Rae was unusual for the time because he had actually adapted to the local Inuit methods. He knew how to build an igloo, he knew how to drive dogs, he knew how to ski. And he didn't get scurvy because he knew how to learn to live off the land. So he was eating relatively fresh food. He was a prodigious explorer. And he ran into a bunch of Inuit in the middle of nowhere, as you do. And he noticed that one of them was wearing navy buttons or something like that, or a braid on his hat. And he asked him, where did you get those from? And the story came out. And the chap pointed him in the direction of where they'd found this material. And sure enough, he went there and he met some more Inuit and he saw some bones. And one of the things which was evident were cut marks on the bones, not bite marks from wolves or bears, but actually straight line cuts, which had been from a knife, almost certainly.
It's butchering, basically.
Rae's instinct was to rush back to the UK, or he could have gone looking for yet more evidence. But do you rush back with the news? It was late in the season, and so he jumped on a boat and came home. He arrived home with this awful news that he'd found traces of the Franklin expedition. But, and here's the bad news, lads, I've also found evidence of cannibalism. British society went ballistic. They couldn't cope with this. This was well beyond what Victorian sensibilities could possibly stomach. And there was a campaign of vitriol against John Rae. There was a reward of £10,000 to find out what happened. That money was withheld from him. Jane Franklin, who was leading the campaign to search for her missing husband, she vilified him. And somebody called Charles Dickens, you may have heard of him, was the most famous journalist of the decade. And he called them, he said, all Inuit are savages and liars.
Oh, man.
They could, why?
Okay, so it's completely unacceptable to them. Well, I mean, it's a dark secret to
as I say, Victorian sensibilities couldn't stomach this. It was very unpalatable stuff.
So what does poor old Rae do?
Well, Rae he said, more or less, I've told you what I saw. Don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah.
I'm just here to tell you what happened. And so the long and short of it is, Britain then went to war separately in the Crimea with Russia. So its first battle for over 30 years since the Napoleonic Wars. They weren't interested in dead, missing explorers.
Okay.
And so they wrote these men off and said, they're all dead. It doesn't matter anymore. They're not coming back. Forget about them.
Okay, close that.
Jane Franklin maintained a very, very determined and very aggressive campaign for people to go looking for her husband. And she paid for a man from Dundalk called Leopold McClintock to captain a ship and go look where, in the area where Rae had found this evidence.
Well, I wanted to, just because this is a Royal Dublin Society lecture series, I thought it was important to stress the connection here, because Leopold McClintock, his bust is here. He's got a bust by Kirk.
A great man, in my view.
A remarkable man. We claim him as a family member in my family, but I noted that he'd given a speech in 1857, which I guess this is when Lady Franklin had put a call out, and he, in his speech to the RDS, he says, "It is in our power to rescue the survivors, or at least to ascertain their fate, without periling a single life and at a comparatively trifling expense. That we refuse to do so is a deep national disgrace." So that was his motive.
That sounds like Leopold McClintock for sure.
Okay.
It's very apposite, and he was dead right. It wasn't very expensive, and he also took a very small party. It's a bit of an aside, but it's an important aside. These British explorers, they went mob-handed. Each ship would have a complement of over 60 people. That's 60 mouths to feed. The McClintock expedition, I think he took 25.
Okay.
That's much easier to handle. And also they were men who could travel over land. He got some Inuit speakers as well to help him.
And he got dogs, didn't he?
He knew how to drive dogs, not brilliantly, but he did have a smattering of dog skills. He didn't take dogs on the bit that matters, because one of his lieutenants, a Hobson, is the man who found the cairn
with the tin can.
Yeah, with the tin can, with the Crozier note. And so they knew then, that Franklin had died, Crozier was in charge, and that he'd gone to the Great Fish River, which of course they never made, because subsequently we discovered, quite literally, a trail of bodies. Well, they were bones at this point, but a trail of bodies all along the south coast of King William Island, which is, as fate would have it, the Northwest Passage.
Well, that's what makes it even more interesting, because in the last 4 or 5 years, or maybe a bit more, since 2014, I think it is, 2 rather big clues have turned up.
Huge clues. I mean, there's been a very, very big advance, and it's the reason that I decided to update the book, because the story has moved on significantly. It is just worth recapping here. When McClintock comes back with news of the document, you would have thought in most terms that would be the end of the story. Everybody would go into mourning, and you'd have a service, and you'd issue medals to the widows and all of that, the usual thing they did. Not a bit of it. This kick-started a campaign which lasted 170 years, and it's still going on today, to find out what happened to the Franklin expedition. In short, there was a fusillade of expeditions to go looking over the following century, the following decades. More men went looking for the dead than ever went looking for the living over the next decades. And then in 2008, Canada became involved officially, and they sent proper ships, research ships. And in 2014, they discovered the wreck of Franklin's ship, the Erebus, which is lying in 35 feet of water, so 8-9 meters of water, perfectly preserved. And in 2016, they found HMS Terror, which was Crozier's ship, and he would have been in command. And that's in about 80 feet, so 27 meters or so of water. And the great thing which I am so pleased to be able to pass on, is that all those expeditions from 1860 that went looking for clues, again, they knew, roughly speaking, where to look, and they came back with lots of bones, lots of relics, and all of that sort of stuff. But the only people they didn't take any notice of were the Inuit. The Inuit have had, until very recently, a tradition of oral history, not unlike the Irish had a great tradition of oral history. There's no paper above the tree line. There are no books. Nobody could read or write. But oral history, as I said in the book, is worth the complete works of Shakespeare to the Inuit. They passed on these stories down the centuries. They could go back hundreds of years with some accuracy about various major events. When they were questioned, these men said, the ships, they're over there. And they pointed where they, roughly speaking, where they were. And in very round terms, that's where they found them. Okay. But it took 160 years for someone to ask. And when they were discovered, the then sort of leading Inuit archivist and whatever, said, more or less, I told you so.
Okay. Right. I'm sure there's a lesson or many
Which
to
is
be
a wonderful
learned.
story. It's lovely for the Inuit to be finally recognised.
Okay. God almighty. Right. So there's a series of people just not listening to the truth being told.
Over decades.
Okay. Well, it's so exciting to have the two ships. Both ships are there. They're being very diligent and cautious about excavating them, or whatever the term is. What can we expect to find? I mean, these are going to could be lovely clues here, or?
Well, I did some investigations with the marine archaeologists, and the thing which came out of my discussions with them is their astonishment at how well preserved the ships are. They've never seen anything like it. They've been there for 170 years.
Why are they so well preserved?
They're upright.
Yeah.
And they've sent cameras down, so we've been through the ships. Everything is shipshape.
Okay.
The crockery is on the shelf. The beds are all made. The drawers are all closed. Everything is almost as though they got up and left. There's a build-up of silt, but the ships are in very, very good condition. And in fact, Crozier's ship is in better condition, deeper, than the Franklin ship, which is in more shallow water. But what they've done is they've sent cameras down. They've retrieved some objects already. The general feeling is, and I'm not a marine archaeologist, and I wouldn't pretend to be, the feeling is this will take at least 10 years.
Okay.
Because there is so much.
Can ink survive?
This is the crucial question.
Yeah.
Francis Crozier was a Navy man for 30 odd years. He was a man who did things by order. The Navy does things by order. He will have kept detailed records of everything. His charts, his logs, and probably, I believe, his personal letters to people, maybe Sophie Craycroft. His desk has been found in his private quarters, and the camera has filmed as close as I am to you. To Crozier said, the drawers are closed, but they're going to open those drawers, and they're going to take out what's in them, and there will be documents in there. The Canadians are very, very optimistic that they will retrieve the papers, and because of modern conservation techniques, I've spoken to paper conservators in London, like the British Library, the V&A in London, those sorts of people, they say yes, you will be able to read it. They can use infrared, they can use all sorts of the latest technology, and in time they'll say yes, you will find it. And the last tantalising thing to say on this is they took with them one of the very, very first adaptions of a camera, a thing called a daguerreotype.
Yes, yeah. They took the pictures with the daguerreotype, didn't
they? Yeah, they took them before they went. Yeah. That's a picture of a daguerreotype. Well, they took a camera with them as well. And the belief is we may even be able to retrieve photographs.
That is all deeply exciting, isn't it? So
it's genuinely, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, Turtle, I'm just a storyteller. I'm just passing on. It is an incredible story. And it has all sorts of, it obviously has the romance and the poor old Francis's lost love life. But this is a story which is unusual in the sense that for most bits of history, it ends. You have a battle or somebody dies and that's full stop, new chapter. This is the story that just refuses to lie down. And it keeps coming back. So 170 years after the event, we're now about to investigate a completely new branch. Now, I don't know at all what they're going to find, and nor do they. Yeah. But you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to be an incredible few years. And they say 10 years. Obviously, it's been suspended because of COVID, but they are the Canadians are absolutely gagging to get their hands on the stuff. Amazing. Okay. Well, look, I mean, one of the person who I feel rather sorry for here is your friend, Francis Crozier, because he does get overlooked. It's obviously called the Franklin Expedition. You don't really know about, well, I think your book is doing a lot to correct that. I hope so, yeah. I guess because he died, he didn't come back successfully to be knighted and to be, eulogized and also immortalized as a hero. Do you feel like he's been sidelined? He feels a bit sidelined. Oh, unquestionably. I mentioned a bit while back that after the Napoleonic War, Britain sent this flurry of ships and explorers, Navy men to become explorers. Franklin, Parry, Ross, Richardson, Back, all these guys. Every single one of them received a knighthood.
Yeah, I was going to say.
The only one who didn't is called Francis Crozier. He never wrote a book about his exploits. All the others wrote books. They came back and they had a year off and wrote a book and became semi-famous. They were very popular. You know, they'd have been on social media today 200 years ago.
I get the impression he wouldn't have been. I don't think he would have been tweeting. He seems very modest.
I don't think he would have been a tweeter, no. I think he was a man who shunned the limelight. And he never sought fame, and he never wrote a book, so he never wrote down anything. We don't know an awful lot of his emotions. Quite a few of his letters have survived, but they're mostly to do with the expedition. But he was immensely highly regarded by his colleagues.
Yeah.
And you know, one episode which illustrates that is the expedition to the Antarctic. It was a 4-year job, and the role of leadership was given to James Clark Ross, who was the leading British explorer of the time, a fabulous explorer. And he was given a blank cheque, in effect, could take what he wanted to go and explore the Antarctic. And he chose Francis Crozier. From the entire ranks of the Navy, he chose Francis to go as his number 2 because he trusted him.
Well,
and he was reliable. And that was that he was a trustworthy, reliable man. It's possible that his Irishness didn't ring too well in the Admiralty, that they weren't particularly impressed with him. I'm not sure that was a major factor, but I'm sure it would have been a factor of sorts.
I suppose also the fact that he was on an expedition that, you know, essentially ended in such dismal failure. But this is my final question to you. Do you think, apart from having turned right when they might have turned left, was it inevitable? Was this going to be their fate from the moment they set off? Because it was a particularly harsh winter, wasn't it? Or
Yes.
was there, you know, if somebody else had been in charge, if Ross had been in charge, would it have succeeded? And is Crozier therefore culpable to an extent or not?
I think it would have, had they pursued the same track, I think they would have had the same fate. I think if Ross had been in charge, or indeed if Francis Crozier had been in charge, I think that they were all going to perish. They were irretrievably trapped. Okay. And I suppose the only thing is they might have abandoned ship earlier, but they didn't. You know, it was a pretty awful story, and some people felt that they lived for years wandering in this wilderness. I doubt that somehow.
Yeah,
but it's an extraordinary story, and as I said, it's very unusual writing history books which keep getting brought up to date. Most history comes to an end somewhere, you know.
No, you're going to have to keep updating it.
I'll have to. Yeah, I'll come back in a couple of years' time. You know.
We'll talk again. Well, listen, it has been absolutely fascinating. I love it. As you say, it is a really very interesting story. I'm very pleased that I wasn't on the expedition myself. But I think we'd better call a halt to it. I'd just like to say thanks to the Dublin Book Festival. And there are plenty more events happening this week at the Dublin Book Festival, so check out their website, dublinbookfestival.ie or .com, I can't remember, look it up. Thanks also to Gerard Whelan, the librarian at the Royal Dublin Society. There are details of the RDS library and archive, including access to its online digital archive and its various activities. Again, you can find them online at rds.ie. And an especially big thanks to Michael Smith, author of Icebound in the Arctic, The Mystery of Captain Crozier, I keep on saying his name wrong, and the Franklin Expedition, published by O'Brien. It has been an absolute pleasure. Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.